On the opening pages of his book, The Monks of Tibhirine, John Kaiser writes, quote, "The monks eventually became victims in a struggle among Muslims, a struggle that had gone horribly wrong and had cost from 60,000 to 100,000 Algerian lives by 1996. Yet the monks were not martyrs to the faith. They did not die because they were Christians. They died because they wouldn't leave their Muslim friends who depended on them and whose lives were in equal danger," unquote. By a narrow definition of martyrdom for the faith, Kaiser may be right in his thesis, but a counter-argument and an expanded definition would maintain that one dies for the faith if one dies simply because he or she has lived and acted in accord with the faith. This past spring, on January 27, 2018, the Vatican announced that Pope Francis had approved the beatification of 19 servants of God, the slain Bishop of Oran, Pierre-Lucien Claverie, 7 Trappist monks, and 11 other religious. Killed between 1994 and 1996 in the midst of the sea of violence that engulfed Algeria. These men and women will all be beatified as martyrs in hatred of the faith. In April, the Algerian government approved the plan for the beatification ceremony to take place in Oran and welcomed Pope Francis to come to Algeria for the occasion. But the actual beatification ceremony, originally planned for this fall, has been postponed for logistical and political reasons leading up to an election year. Although the official French inquiry into the deaths of the monks of Tibhirine found no evidence they had actually been killed by government forces, perhaps in a botched rescue attempt, perhaps in an orchestrated counter-terrorist action, rumors continue to circulate, and the case remains in many ways mysterious. Although the Church will officially recognize the monks of Tibhirine, together with other religious men and women, as martyrs for the faith, and rightly so, our Saturday with the Saints series this year honors them as Christian saints of interreligious dialogue in a Muslim-majority country. Dialogue and silence. The silence of listening to God and others belongs to the Christian faith they lived. The love of these 7 Trappists for the people of Algeria, the affection and respect they held in their local community, and their promotion of Christian-Muslim dialogue is well documented and known to many of us, I suspect, through the award-winning French-language film Of Gods and Men, released in 2010. Father Christian de Chergé, the abbot of the monastery in Tibhirine, was very actively involved in interreligious dialogue through the Ribat es-Salam, Bond of Peace group that held its meetings both in Algiers and at Tibhirine. What I want to emphasize in my talk today is the way that Muslim-Christian dialogue was influenced from within by another less well-known interreligious dialogue, a Jewish-Christian dialogue. In surprising ways, as I hope to show, the monks of Tibhirine were inspired in the witness they bore to Christ in their practiced love of neighbor by their reading of Emmanuel Levinas, the great Jewish philosopher and ethicist whose death in 1995 very shortly preceded their own. A survivor of the Holocaust that took the lives of millions of European Jews, including many members of his own family, Levinas had stimulated a rich conversation between Jews and Christians. That dialogue has now found its remarkable witness in martyrdom and in the written spiritual testimony of Father Christian de Chergé, which echoes the distinctive vocabulary of Levinas, blending it with the message of the gospel. Of Gods and Men depicts in a condensed, somewhat fictionalized fashion the historical events that took place between 1993 and 1996 in Tibhirine, Algeria. I had the privilege of hearing Father Armand Veille, the Belgian scholar, monk, and former superior general of the Cistercian order, when he spoke in early 2012 here at the University of Notre Dame about the socio-political situation that led to the kidnapping of 7 French monks from their monastery. During the night of Wednesday, March 27, 1996, and to their eventual deaths, reportedly at the hands of their Islamist captors, but perhaps, as retired General Francois Buchwalter confessed in 2009, through the Algerian army. Father Armand knew these monks personally. When the GIA announced their killing, said to have occurred on May 21st, Father Armand traveled with Father Bernardo Oliveira to Algeria. They were present when the remains, the severed heads of Father Christian de Chergé, Brother Luc Dossier, Father Christophe Le Breton, Brother Michel Fleury, Father Bruno Lemanchard, Father Christian Reinjar, and Brother Paul Favre-Mivi were recovered, identified, and subsequently buried in the monastery cemetery at Tibhirine on June 4, 1996. Speaking at Notre Dame, Father Armand mentioned in passing that Father Christian de Chergé, the prior of the monastery of Our Lady of Atlas at Tibhirine, had read and admired the writings of Emmanuel Levinas, and that Christian's own words and writings, above all his spiritual testament, reflect the distinctive language of Levinas. That mention, of course, prompted the desire in me to explore more deeply the influence of Levinas upon the thinking of Father Christian and his fellow monks during the years, months, and days when they struggled with the decision to stay in Algeria under the constant threat of violence. Father Armand has since written to me, quote, "I remember that Father Christian talked to me about Levinas. I personally knew little of Levinas at that time, so I did not pay too much attention. I know that he and Father Christophe were reading Totality and Infinity," unquote. Scholars David Hodge and Donald McGlynn have confirmed the importance of Levinas to the monks. Quote, "Some of the concepts at the center of Levinas's thought provided Father Christian and Father Christophe with a catalyst for the expression of their ideals and their understanding of the death at the hands of others which they felt to be approaching," unquote. The history of the martyrs of Tibhirine is thus also a Levinasian history, marked by their response to the practical demands of a Levinasian ethics. The so-called spiritual testament of Father Christian de Chergé was composed by him between December 1, 1993 and January 1, 1994, dated and sealed in an envelope sent to his youngest brother, Gérard, with the instructions that it not be opened until after his death. Opened and read for the first time 2 years later, on Pentecost Sunday, May 26, 1996, the short testament, a bare 3 pages long in Bernardo Oliveira's English translation, has been honored as a text worthy of inclusion among the world's great spiritual writings. The testament begins with these words: "When we face an adieu, if today, and it may be today, I happen to be a victim of the terrorism that now seems to engulf all the foreigners living in Algeria. I would like my community, my church, my family to remember that my life was given to God and to this country. May they accept that the sole master of every life cannot be indifferent to this brutal form of departure. May they associate this death with so many others just as violent, left in the indifference of anonymity. My life is not worth more than any other, nor is it worth less. In a letter of condolence sent to Father Oliveira, then the Abbot General, Pope John Paul II confessed that he was, quote, deeply moved and strengthened by Father Christian's spiritual testament, in which is so evident the greatness of soul with which these brothers of the Atlas Monastery lived through such particularly hostile situations, unquote. Writing later on October 10, 1996, on the occasion of a memorial mass for the 7 martyred monks, John Paul II again referred to the testament left behind by Dom Christian de Chergé, saying that it, quote, offered to all the key for understanding the tragic occurrence in which he and his confreres were involved, unquote. The spiritual testament is indeed a key for understanding, but it is also a mysterious key requiring its own exegesis, a commentary incomplete without reference to Emmanuel Levinas. The opening, middle, and closing of the Testament echo the specific language of Levinas's philosophical writings. The Testament begins, in fact, with a sentence fragment, a half line of poetry, as it were, when we face an adieu. The English translation loses some of the wordplay present in the French text, where adieu is capitalized and hyphenated, and where the noun adieu is potentially both the object and the subject of the verb to face, which is itself derived from a noun. It might thus be rendered, when an adieu faces. At one level, the words, as Father Oliveira notes, signal, quote, the context of a possible departure which only God can know, unquote. This literal historical sense is clear in what follows, where Father Christian writes, quote, if it should happen one day, and it could be today, that I become a victim of the terrorism that now seems to engulf all foreigners living in Algeria, I would like my community, my church, and my family to remember that my life was given to God and to this country, unquote. The oddity of Father Christian's diction in the opening phrase, when we face an adieu, suggests a deeper philosophical, theological, Levinasian meaning, however. As Jacques Derrida highlighted in his Adieu to Emmanuel Levinas, dated December 27, 1995, Levinas understood the neighbor, the other person, as an adieu in multiple senses. In his essay, Notes on Meaning, Levinas describes the hyphenated adieu as a responsibility coming before my freedom, from before all beginnings to me, and from before every present. An adieu that is at once devotion and transcendence. In that same essay, he identifies the face as an adieu with a latent birth of meaning, the unto God that is the transcendence that makes possible all intuition, all intentionality, and all aiming, unquote. The face of the other is a divine calling, a greeting, a summons to responsibility, an adieu. for Levinas. But so too is the eye of the one who, quote, in the mode of an immemorial freedom, older than being, older than the decision and the acts, says, here I am, in response to that summons to responsibility. In this sense, the I in its adieu, writes Levinas, signifies the inalienable responsibility that is the uniqueness of the elected, the one called to give testimony. So the I is an adieu and the you is an adieu. Facing an adieu in his testament, Father Christian confronts the terrorist neighbor who holds him hostage, the younger brother and all the family members to whom he writes in the testimony, and the exteriority of his own expected imminent death. The capitalized word given in the clause, my life was given to God and to this country, has, of course, a biblical echo. Jesus, before his arrest, insists, quote, no one takes my life from me, but I lay it down, I give it of my own accord, unquote, John 10:8. The capitalization, however, in the Testament, and the Levinasian echoes throughout the Testament, suggest a further philosophical resonance. Whereas Heidegger played with the givenness, the Geben of es gibt, Levinas writes, quote, responsibility for the other man, the impossibility of my leaving him alone with the mystery of death, is concretely, across all modalities of giving, the taking upon myself of the ultimate gift of dying for another, unquote. Father Christian began to write his testament on December 1, 1993 in Algiers. On October 30th, 1993, the GIA had officially declared war on foreigners in Algeria, announcing, quote, foreigners have 30 days to leave the country. If they do not, they are responsible for their own death, unquote. That ultimatum, publicized through the release of kidnapped French consular officials, had expired on December 1st. In quick succession, a reign of terror had begun that affected native Muslims and foreign nationals alike. On December 14, 1993, 2 miles from the monastery at Tibhirine, 12 Croatian construction workers were brutally killed, their throats cut. 10 days later, Christmas Eve, marked the significant encounter of Father Christian de Chergé and his fellow monks with Saya Attia, the executioner of the Croats and the emir of the combatants in the central region. Accompanied by other armed men, Attia had broken into the monastery at night, demanded to see the Pope of the house, and asked to take Brother Luke, an 80-year-old physician beloved throughout the district, who was himself in ill health, back with him to tend wounded GIA members. Attia had asked, too, for money and medical supplies. Christian had stood his ground, insisting that the intruders keep their weapons outside because the monastery was a house of prayer. He also refused to let them take Luke, encouraging them instead to bring their wounded to the dispensary for treatment. He told Attia that monks have no material wealth, live poorly, and reminded the terrorists of the holiness of that Christmas night. Muslims, too, after all, venerate Jesus as a prophet. In response, Attia had offered his hand to Christian and departed after promising, threatening, to send someone else for another visit. From a Levinasian perspective, this face-to-face encounter between Father Christian and the terrorist leader assumes a great significance. When the army reported Attia's death the following February, the newspapers attributed to the GIA leader the responsibility for over 200 terrorist attacks and 132 assassinations. Drawing inspiration from Levinas, Christian de Chergé, in turn, assumed responsibility for Attia and for Attia's responsibility. In the Spiritual Testament, Christian asks that his death not be singled out for exalted remembrance as a martyr, but, quote, associated with so many other equally violent ones which are forgotten through indifference or anonymity, unquote. Remembering a long and complicated history of French colonialism in Algeria and assuming his own responsibility for these deaths, Christian writes, quote, I have lived long enough to know that I am an accomplice in the evil which seems, alas, to prevail in the world, even in the evil which might blindly strike me down, unquote. One cannot read these words without hearing Levinas, who often quotes the words of Dostoevsky. We are all guilty of all, and for all men, before all, and I more than the others, unquote. You might also think of a Mother Teresa. Once somebody, a newspaper man asked her, well, what is really wrong with the world? And Mother Teresa said, I'm what's wrong with the world. Three weeks before his kidnapping on March 8, 1996, Christian had led a retreat at the diocesan house at the request of Bishop Henri Tézier. Remembering the 1993 encounter with Attia on Christmas Eve, Christian testified, quote, I felt that I was my brother's keeper, even of the brother in front of me that night. As his keeper, I should be able to find in him more than that which he had become. Describing 5 pillars of peace, patience, poverty, presence, prayer, and forgiveness, Christian elaborated upon the meaning of presence in an explicitly Levinasian way. Quote, when I approach my neighbor, I also become his guardian, which means to become his hostage. Justice begins with the other. Take the case of Saya Attia. I was not only the guardian of my brothers in the monastery, but his guardian too, the guardian of this man who stood opposite me and who should have been able to discover within himself more than he had become. I think this happened in some small measure to the degree that he gave way that night, unquote. In his philosophical writings, Levinas famously writes that in our inescapable responsibility to the other, our bond of responsibility, which is also a bondage, we stand as a hostage before and to the other. The biblical command at the heart of Levinasian, the biblical command at the heart of Levinasian ethics, thou shalt not kill, was much on the mind of Christian de Chergé during that retreat in March 1996. Citing Emmanuel Levinas, Christian paraphrased the French Jewish philosopher saying, morality entered the world with the commandment, thou shalt not kill. The first words a person's face says to another is, respect me. Killing can take different forms, as all who live within a community know. A contemptuous attitude, a wounding word, phrases that assassinate are other ways to kill, unquote. Thou shalt not kill, Christiane preached. Not kill yourself, not kill time, which belongs to God, not kill trust, not kill death itself by trivializing it, not kill the country, the other person, or the church, unquote. After the episode with Attia, he recalled, quote, I wanted to pray for him. What should I pray to God? Kill him? No, but I could pray, disarm him. But then I asked myself, do I have the right to ask God to disarm him if I don't begin by asking, disarm me, disarm my brothers? That was my prayer each day. In his spiritual testament, Christiane hopes to be able, at the hour of his death, to ask forgiveness of God and of my fellow human beings, and to forgive with all his heart the one who will strike him down, the one he names his last-minute friend who will not have known what he was doing. He expresses sorrow at the thought that people he loves, the people of Algeria, innocent Muslims, may be, quote, indiscriminately accused, unquote, of his murder. This part of the testament is especially poignant, given that Mohammed, a Muslim man, a friend of Christiane's, a village policeman, had once protected him at the cost of his own life during an attack in 1959 by FLN rebels, members of the National Liberation Front. During the months leading up to the kidnapping of the 7 months of Tibhirine, many religious persons, thousands of Muslim imams who oppose violence against civilians, and also prominent Christian leaders, among them Sister Paul-Hélène Saint-Ramond, Father Henri Verger, a Marist brother and close friend of Father Christian de Chergé, 2 Spanish nuns, Sister Esther and Caridad, 4 white fathers, 2 sisters of the Sacred Heart, were murdered in successive attacks that drew protests amidst the atmosphere of escalating violence. John Kaiser estimates that in 1994, 1,000 persons were killed weekly in Algeria, leading some religious communities to withdraw their members from the community. The situation, as Kaiser explains, was complex. Quote, by 1994 to 95, there was always at least 4 possible suspects for any given horror story: terrorists, government forces, local self-defense militias, and simple bandits or people with personal grudges to settle. In the murky netherworld of ambiguity and opaqueness, many suspected the military was not above using the GIA to camouflage its own internal feuding, unquote. The monks of Tibhirine endeavored to avoid siding either with what they called the Brothers of the Plain, that is, the military, or the Brothers of the Mountains, the Islamist terrorists, as they called them, and refused the government's offers of protection. In the film of Gods and Men, the historical sequence of events is compressed so that the difficult decision of the monks to stay at the monastery is presented as a one-time decision, whereas it was, in fact, a decision that was made and remade again and again in the community during the 3 years between December 1, 1993 and March 27, 1996, the night of the kidnapping. As the film shows, the thinking of the monks was guided by the spiritual awareness that they had, in some sense, already died through their baptism into Christ and their monastic vows of poverty, chastity, obedience, and stability. The fear of death, palpable as it was, therefore had no fundamental hold upon them. Rather, they discovered that they were always already bound in responsibility to Christ himself, to each other, to the people and the land of Algeria, the site of the monastery. Since its foundation on March 7th, 1938, the monastery had functioned as an anchor hold for the village of Tibhirine, which had grown up and prospered peacefully and economically in the environs of the monastery. The monks were respected and beloved by the local population. Even Saya Atiyah did not consider them foreigners, but rather Christian monks to be honored in obedience to the Quran. The people of Tibhirine wanted the monks to stay. As Musa, a member of the town, told Father Christian, quote, "If you go away, you will rob us of your hope, and we will lose ours," unquote. For their part, the monks too desired to stay. They considered the possibility of relocating as a community, but then, one by one, they concluded, "I'm not at peace with the decision to leave." As John Kaiser relates, fear wrestled with a sense of responsibility, calling, and the duty of obedience. As each man expressed his view, the vow of stability kept returning as the touchstone of their thinking. Stability meant that they were bound not only to a specific place, but to persons, to their neighbors, and to one another, unquote. Within this monastic framework, Levinasian's doctrine of infinite responsibility, of being always already bound to the other in an inescapable, ethically and demanding relationship, found a resounding echo. In his book, Otherwise Than Being, Levinas famously uses two images to express this relationship of being bound, that of the hostage and of the pregnant woman. This responsibility for the neighbor, this substitution as a hostage, writes Levinas, is the subjectivity and uniqueness of a subject. Levinas similarly observes, quote, "Maternity, in the complete being for the other which characterizes it, is the ultimate sense of this vulnerability," unquote. Referring to the gestation of the other in the same, which this responsibility for the other signifies, Levinas describes how, quote, "the oneself is provoked as irreplaceable, as devoted to the others without being able to resign, and thus as incarnated in order to offer itself, to suffer, and to give." These very images appear in the writings of Father Christophe Le Breton, the youngest of the martyred monks of Tibhirine, 46 years old at the time of the kidnapping. His journal, the first entry dated August 8, 1993, has been called the best commentary on and complement to the Testament written by Christian. Like Father Christian, Father Christophe had read and admired Levinas. In his journal entry for January 2, 1996, the year of his own kidnapping and death, Father Christophe explicitly notes the death of Levinas, which had taken place a week earlier on Christmas Day, 1995. Jour de Noël, Levinas est mort. Levinas is dead. A month later, in the entry for January 18, 1996, Father Christophe again mentions Levinas by name and quotes verbatim a passage from Otherwise Than Being about the "Here I am" as a witness to the glory of the infinite. In that same entry, Christophe recalls the command, "Love your enemies, pray for them." anticipating that he and his fellow monks may be held as hostages, and again echoing otherwise than being, where Levinas uses the image of the hostage, Christophe writes in the following in his entry for January 4th, 1995, quote, "A hostage takes the place of others, but it must be a free commitment on his part in order that this role of victim be filled with love and forgiveness," unquote. Invoking the example of Jesus, the Son who is infinitely brother, Christophe addresses Christian Chergier, one of the 4 white fathers who had recently been killed, saying, quote, "As a friend of yours, I have to pray for your assassins," unquote. On Christmas Eve 1993, when Saya Attia and his men first broke into the monastery, Father Christophe had fled, hiding in the basement. This episode, by the way, may have inspired the filmmaker in Of Gods and Men to depict one of the 2 surviving monks as having hid himself under his bed in March 1996 when the 7 were kidnapped, a hiding that did not, in fact, occur. When Father Christophe left the basement in 1993 and made his appearance upstairs hours after the terrorists had left, he found the others going quietly about their regular duties, and he felt embarrassed about his fear, his desertion of his brothers. Comparing the empty cask in which he had hid to a wooden womb, Christophe writes in his journal about a period of gestation and an ascent from the abyss. Quote, "I was born again on December 24th, he declares, adding, "I have to convert to become an infant," unquote. While Levinas prefers to speak of the exercise responsibility in Judaism as a religion of adults, Father Christophe reverses this relationship to emphasize the responsibility of the child, the Christ child, and of the Christian, the child of God. Quote, "The new life of this child is stronger than any assassination and death," observes Bernardo Oliveira, who recalls that on Christmas 1995, less than 3 months before the kidnapping, Father Christophe had made a creche out of the kashabia, a camel hair tunic with a large hood, of Henri Verger, who had been assassinated the previous year. A maternal image, Father Christophe uses it, this tunic, in his journal, in an entry dated January 16, 1996, to describe his own sense of responsibility. Quote, "In the folds of a kashabia, stronger than murder, it is he, born in the midst of us, to be offered in our lives," unquote. Consecrated to Mary, the mother of Jesus, Father Christophe wrote on March 19, 1996, quote, "Near you, I am what I should be, offered." Father Christian's spiritual testament similarly closes with a grateful address to God for this life lost, totally mine, totally theirs, a life inclusive of his friends and family members, of his Muslim neighbors, and of his last-minute friend, his executioner. Father Christian's explanation of his thank you and adieu to his killer is expressed in a way that has challenged translators. On the screen you see a translation given on the web, the translation provided by John Kaiser in his book, and a preliminary translation by Father Oliveira. "Yes," he writes, "I want this thank you and this adieu to be for you too, because in God's face I see yours. Father Oliveira notes that in this conclusion, quote, Christian is playing with words, like the poet he was. Grammatically, the only really clear elements are that he is directly addressing his assassin and that he divides the verb envisager in order to emphasize visage, face, unquote. Interpreting the line in the light of a previous passage where Christian imagines himself being able to, quote, contemplate with the Heavenly Father his children of Islam, Oliveira concludes, his thought in this sentence is interpreted better as, in God's face I see yours, rather than in your face I see God's. I don't know what's happened there. Go back, try again. There. Interpreting the line primarily within a Levinasian context, however, the latter seems more likely. Next to Father Christian's use of a hyphenated capitalized adieu, his division of the word envisage points to the rich Levinasian meaning of the face. For Levinas, the relationship to the face is straightaway ethical. The face is what one cannot kill, or at least it is that whose meaning consists in thou shalt not kill, unquote. For Levinas, the face is primarily that of the other in his or her nakedness, exposure, need, vulnerability. The face of the one who is mortal, whether alien, friend, or foe. The Testament of Father Christian similarly invokes all of these relationships in its use of the word face as noun and verb. Noting a link between face and discourse, he says, the face speaks. Levinas, in his interview by Philippe Nemo, highlights his distinction. Quote, in discourse between the saying and the said, unquote. Father Christian's wordplay in his spiritual testament is reminiscent, as we have seen, of Levinas's own, even as it extends the interreligious dialogue between Jews and Christians, in which Levinas himself engaged, into a trialogue among Jews, Christians, and Muslims. It may be that wordplay itself, in the forms of double entendre, etymologies, paronomasia, hyphenation, personification, etc., is a way of turning the said once more into a saying that is part of a dialogue. What has been said, the familiar words of Jesus, of the Bible, of the Decalogue, become a saying, a living word, when it speaks to us in concrete circumstances, personal relationships, in our duties to our neighbor. David Hodges and Donald McGlynn note that Christian and Christophe shared the thought of Levinas with the members of the Ribat interreligious group. In Easter 1995, in that meeting of the Ribat as-Salam, Christophe said, quote, to receive from you my being as a face, searching for your face, is freedom, an investiture which makes it impossible for me to shy away from my neighbor. And then in parentheses he says, C. E. Levinas. And he continues, in your face you look at me, stranger, prisoner, naked, famished. You can call one to hope. It is up to me to put it to work, unquote. On the very eve of their abduction, as the minutes of the meeting March 25 to 28 record, Father Christian meditated with the members of the interreligious group on the verse, quote, O God, you are my hope in the face of all living people, unquote. It's from Psalm 16. adapting Levinas to their own theological project and understanding and to their concrete situation. The monks of Tibhirine believed, and here I quote Hodges and McGlynn, that, quote, the philosophy of Levinas can act as a bridge between the great religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, which all see as relational, and each person's primary relationship with the other as ethical. We remember and honor today 7 martyrs of dialogue, men who conversed in prayer with God, who wrestled with themselves, who shared their faith with their Muslim neighbors through words and service, and who made flesh the gospel message and their monastic vows by living them out and making them come alive also for us. What I hope to have underscored is that the Jewish thought of Emmanuel Levinas has also left its unmistakable imprint upon the minds and hearts of the monks of Tibhirine, and its verbal echo in a Christian classic, the Spiritual Testament of Father Christian de Chergé. His earthly goodbye, his adieu, and that of his brothers in their martyrdom was and remains also a going to God, whom he faced in the face of his neighbor. One cannot help but think at the end of the Laudato Si of another saint of interreligious dialogue, St. Francis of Assisi, whose Canticle of the Creatures concludes with a praise of God for our sister bodily death. Blessed are those whose death will find in your most holy will. For the second death, the death of judgment, shall do them no harm. Thank you.
Friends, we have time for one question.
Oh my goodness.
Maybe 2.
Noah.
Noah Fernari, undergrad.
Yeah, I recognize you, Noah. Noah's in my class this semester.
I was just hoping you could reiterate what was the center of Levinas's thought, and why was the reason, do you think, the monks were so attached to that?
Well, the key word is responsibility, which you heard over and over and over, right? And relationship. So we are human beings who live in relationship, and that relationship implies our responsibility for one another. And so that was certainly encouraging to them. But then also the key, the grounds Levinas's thought is the thou shalt not kill. Right? So if you take that as a first principle, kind of everything else unfolds. Right? It's kind of interesting. People sometimes think, well, was Levinas actually a believer, right? He was certainly a practitioner of Judaism, and he regarded the law as God's great gift. But he also spoke a lot about a kind of an atheism, right, which means sometimes we come from God and we go to God, atheism. But he was also a student of Heidegger, so it's kind of very sort of immanentized, right? And so I find it just very fascinating that someone who came from the philosophical and religious place of Levinas should somehow have influenced, Christian monks, to this extent. It somehow reading him made the gospel come alive for them, and it made it particular, right, in its demands.
Maybe one more question.
Yes.
They're part of the Trappist order, right?
Yes, they are.
I assume the superior general, or whatever the head man is called, when this is the 3-year process, he might have had some feeling. Did he give them any orders to leave, or what was his position during all this?
Each monastery has its own abbot, right? And in that way, and it was Father Christian, right? I'm sure they were in constant communication back and forth, so it was a process of discernment for the community as a whole. but we think of the principle of subsidiarity, right? You know, that it's only the people who are actually there who have the most information and the best basis for making a decision. So they would have been supportive of whatever the monks had decided, but they did let them decide.